Hey everyone, this is Steven here from Redolescence with another fragrance review. And this time it's on a fragrance from the designer house of Davidoff, and the fragrance is called The Game. Now, The Game is a fragrance that was released in 2012. It is a woody aromatic fragrance, and the perfumer for this fragrance is Bernard Ellena. Now, many of you might know that Bernard Ellena is actually the younger brother to Jean-Claude Ellena, who has received a lot of formal training, very well-renowned perfumer in the fragrance industry, and I don't think that Bernard Ellena is too far behind. Bernard Ellena is responsible for composing the duo of fragrances from the house of Amouage called Beloved. He also did White Jeans by Versace for Her, which is a 1997 release, and then he went ahead and composed a fragrance from the house of Hanny Mori, which is a self-titled fragrance for women. So the majority of his compositions are marketed for women, but nevertheless I think he did a very good job on composing this fragrance from the house of Davidoff when they enlisted his help on this fragrance. Now, the first thing that I want to throw out there in terms of the name, just as a consumer, be wary of the fact that there is another fragrance from the house of Davidoff, which is actually a flanker to Cool Water, called Cool Water Game. So if you're looking at purchasing this fragrance online and for some reason the website that you're purchasing it from does not have an image displayed, just be cautious of the fact that if it does indeed contain Cool Water in the name, you are going to get a totally different fragrance. Now, as far as the name The Game is concerned, I think it is a double entendre. It could either represent or connote one of two things. The first thing that it could represent is a table game that you may play in a casino, whether it's roulette, blackjack, poker, whatever. And the second thing that it could represent, and if you've seen the commercial or the advertisement for this fragrance, it could be the game that guys and girls play with each other, because in the commercial it depicts a guy chasing down a girl and he manages to win her over because he had a good poker face. So it's the game that guys play with girls in terms of winning their admiration and affection for each other. Now, hence the fact that the bottle is shaped like a stack of poker chips, it could very well represent a poker game that you would play in a casino. And also, if you go on ZenoDavidoff.com, which is the official website for this fragrance, you could play an interactive game of blackjack. So very ambiguous, totally subjective. It could either represent one of two things. I think there is a double entendre there. Now, I do think that The Game by Davidoff is Davidoff's attempt at cashing in, no pun intended, on the success of these other contemporary, modern, sweet, clubbing, heavy-hitting, powerhouse type fragrances. And the fragrances that come to mind are 1 Million by Paco Rabanne, which this fragrance has actually gotten compared to a lot. Le Male by Jean-Paul Gaultier, Eros by Versace, Spice Bomb by Viktor and Rolf, so on and so forth. And I do think that this does somewhat of what the other fragrances do, but I think it does it a little bit differently. Of course, in the United States, you have to be 21 to gamble, and being that that's the whole thing that's contained within this fragrance, I do think it's marketed for a bit more of a mature crowd. I know there are a lot of people out there who say that 1 Million and Spice Bomb and HIM by Hanny Mori are marketed for a younger crowd. I do think that this fragrance does that, but it does market it for a bit of an older crowd. Now, with this fragrance in particular, they do have actually a release coming out in 2013, which is a flanker to this fragrance called The Game Intense. And I think that that leaves one to ask the question, was this fragrance so successful that they wanted to give the consumers more by releasing a flanker, or did they not do what they were intended to do with this fragrance well enough, so they decided to redeem themselves through a flanker? Well, I will let you guys know what I think in just a bit, but next up we have the presentation for The Game by Davidoff. Thanks for watching. Here we have the presentation for The Game by Davidoff. This is a fragrance that's available in 3 sizes, 40 milliliters, 60 milliliters, and 100 milliliters, and in Eau de Toilette concentration. The one here is the 100 milliliter size. First up, we have the box, and on the box you're going to find this sleeve here. It actually shows you the 3 sizes, the 100 ml, the 40 ml, and the 60 ml. I think this is kind of cool because instead of reducing the scale of the bottle, they just remove poker chips. So the 40 milliliter bottle has the fewest amount of poker chips. They add to create the 60, and then they add a few more to create the 100 milliliter. Now, on the side, you just have a picture of the 100 milliliter bottle, and these 2 images are repeated on the other sides of the sleeve. Now, the sleeve actually comes off, and it reveals the box for this fragrance, which isn't really anything to marvel at, but I think it's kind of nice. It actually has these lines here representing the different poker chips. It's actually very similar to the bottle. It has the name of the company and the name of the fragrance written right below that here on the front. Nothing going on the sides or the back. On the back you have some information down here at the bottom, and then the UPC codes on the very bottom, which should coincide with the one on the bottom of the bottle. But other than that, not too much else going on with this fragrance. Now, as far as the bottle goes, I do think that the bottle is kind of nice. I know that there are people who say that it looks tacky. I don't really get that. On the very bottom here, you have the name of the company written on the fourth poker chip from the bottom, and then the name of the fragrance written right next to that, and it's repeated alongside the entire circumference of that. Now, like I said, this is a 100 milliliter bottle, so you're going to get the most amount of poker chips on this one. And at the very top here, you have the name of the house and the name of the fragrance right below that. The atomizer for this fragrance actually works pretty well. It's not the best in the game, but it gets the job done. It is a little dribbly right there at the end, as you can tell, but the cap clicks into place very securely, and you can lift the fragrance up from the cap without any fears of it falling off or coming apart. Some people do say that this looks somewhat tacky. I think the bottle isn't entirely tacky. I've seen you know, really bad bottles out there. I think this is one of the better ones, and it actually looks kind of cool in my opinion. So there you have it. That was the presentation for The Game by Davidoff. The Game by Davidoff, like I said, is a woody aromatic fragrance, and I think it stays very true to its genre. I think it was successful enough that the company wanted to come out with a flanker release, hoping or intending that it would sell as many units as this one did, and I think this one was received quite popularly, quite pleasantly, and favorably, if you will. Now, it does open up with this blast of bergamot. It's not a bergamot that overshadows all the other notes in the composition, but it's certainly there and noticeable. It's a very clean, somewhat refined bergamot note, and I think it adds this almost carbonated and sparkling appeal to the fragrance. Now, I know the two notes that are formally listed as notes in this fragrance are gin fizz accord and juniper berries. Now, juniper berries are used in the fermentation of the alcoholic spirit gin, so for them to include both of those notes as top notes in this fragrance, I do think comes across as somewhat redundant. But I can't necessarily say that I get that gin fizz overtone in this fragrance or that accord. And I think what I was really expecting from this fragrance was somewhat of like a carbonated overtone. And I think one note that really succeeds in making that evocation is the note of aldehydes, aldehydic notes. And my experience with the note of aldehyde is that it gives a fragrance a very carbonated appeal. One fragrance that comes to mind right away is a fragrance from the house of Viscata called Magnetism for Men, and that's not necessarily what I'm getting with this fragrance. I think they just wanted to rely solely on the note of bergamot to add that carbonated, almost sparkling introduction, but it's so short-lived that I think for them it doesn't really warrant them listing gin fizz accord as a top note in this fragrance. I think it's more marketing than anything else. Now, I do get a little bit of sweetness in the opening, which I can only attribute to the juniper berry note. It does come across smelling somewhat manufactured and inorganic, but nevertheless, I do get some sweetness that's not attributed to the other note in this fragrance that's really creating a lot of sweetness in this composition. Now, this is one thing that upsetted me just a little bit, is that there's another note in this fragrance whose presence is very undeniable. It comes across so strongly, and I'm actually quite upset that they didn't list it or formally list it as a note in this fragrance, and that is the note of tonka bean. I know it's not formally listed as a note, but if you trust me, I promise you there is a heavy dose of tonka bean in this fragrance. It's not quite a Versace Eros or a Mandarina Duck Pure Black or anything like that, but it's strong enough that it warrants a mention, and there is a lot of tonka bean, and I think that that's what allows these comparisons to be made between this fragrance and 1 Million. However, 1 Million to me comes across much sweeter. It almost has like a brighter feel because of the florals, and it's much more cinnamony. This one does not really have that, and I think one note that's not really allowing it to push or spill too much over into that category is the note of ebony wood. Now, ebony wood for me does not have too distinct of an odor profile. I know sandalwood has a slight creamy sweetness, cedar wood is very dry and smooth, but ebony wood to me, it doesn't really create a particular smell in my mind. But what I can say is that this fragrance, the woods contained within it, do come across smelling rather dense. They smell very full, and they do smell somewhat dark, if I can even use that term. So I think they did succeed at creating a fragrance that's marketed for an older crowd, but also managing to make it stay youthful and contemporary and even playful to an extent. Now, the juniper berry note does not last a very long time in this fragrance. When the tonka bean kicks in, I think it starts to take over all of the other notes in the fragrance, with the ebony wood or the black wood note being the second most concentrated note in the mid of this fragrance. Now, I think this fragrance does have one redeeming feature, and that is the note of iris. There's an iris note contained within this fragrance, and my experience with that note is that it does have the ability to give fragrances a very powdery feel. That's not necessarily what's going on in this fragrance. In this fragrance, on the other hand, it gives it more of a balmy feel. One fragrance that I would compare just the balmy characteristic to is a fragrance from the house of Van Cleef & Arpels called Midnight in Paris. These two fragrances do not smell entirely similar. They don't even smell remotely similar. But I would say that that balmy quality is somewhat similar. I'm just trying to use that as an emphasis in really getting the point across that this one does not smell powdery, rather it smells balmy. There's also a little bit of lavender in the mid that just adds a little bit of personality to the fragrance, but again, not worthy, or it doesn't warrant a mention. Now, this fragrance dries down to some other woody notes, really somewhat imperceptible, also come across as rather inorganic, and there is also a note of vanilla in the dry down. It's not too pronounced, doesn't make too much of a mention, or but I do think it's used as a fixative in this fragrance, and it also enhances that sweetness that you're going to get from the tonka bean. So the bottom line for this fragrance is I was expecting an emphasis on that boozy gin fizz opening, and I really didn't get it. I think they relied solely on the note of bergamot to give off that impression, and it really didn't satisfy it. So I was kind of upset with that. But I do think that this is a nice smelling fragrance. I think Bernard Ellena did an excellent job, hence the reason why they're coming out with a flanker. I think that it has a universal appeal about it. It is a highly complimented fragrance. I've gotten complimented on it many times, and I think it's very successful because of the way that it smells and how it performs. I think the performance on it for an Eau de Toilette is somewhat decent, and I think it's not a bad fragrance at all. There's just, I think, other fragrances out there that do it so much better. I know 1 Million by Paco Rabanne is one comparison that has gotten made to this fragrance a lot. I personally don't get the comparison. I think a better comparison would be Armani Code Ultimate from the house of Giorgio Armani. But then, even then, between those two fragrances, I would reach for Armani Code Ultimate instead. So this fragrance, I think it does something. It does it somewhat well, but it's not the best. It's certainly not a fragrance that's going to represent a decade in perfumery, or a generation for that matter. Now, in terms of compliments or complaints, this is a fragrance that's much more likely, definitely, to land you a compliment. My girlfriend loves this fragrance. I have gotten complimented on it a few times. And lastly, did I wear this fragrance outside of testing? Unfortunately, no. Like I said, I really do like the smell. I enjoy it. It's just I have so many other fragrances that do it better than this one does. One mentioned being Armani Code Ultimate. So with that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching my review. Next up and last up, we have the rating for The Game by Davidoff. Thanks for watching. First up, we have Uniqueness and Overall Smell, and The Game by Davidoff earned from me a 7 out of 10. I don't think this fragrance is entirely unique. I think there are other fragrances out there that utilize some similar notes in this fragrance, and they actually do a somewhat better job at it, in my humble opinion. I think this fragrance made promises that it did not necessarily deliver, especially with that gin fizz opening. If it were a bit more boozier, or if it had like a more authentic sweetness in the opening, I think I would have been much more satisfied. But nevertheless, it's a great smelling fragrance, highly complimented. I've gotten a lot of compliments on it, and it does kind of have like this universal appeal about it. And I think they succeeded in making a fragrance that smelled sweet and playful, but marketed toward an older crowd. So very successful at that. But again, the smell is not entirely unique, and it doesn't last a particularly long time. So I don't think that fixatives were utilized entirely successfully in this fragrance. So I ended up giving it a 7 out of 10. Next up, we have Longevity, and I ended up giving this fragrance a 7 out of 10. On bad days, I do get 5 to 6 hours from this fragrance, but I get 7 hours on average. So performance for this fragrance for an Eau de Toilette, I do think is average to above average, but again, it's not the best longevity in the world. Next up, we have Projection, and I ended up giving this fragrance a 5 out of 10. It seems like this fragrance projects for a couple of hours, but even in those 2 hours that it really projects, it doesn't project beyond an arm's length. So I couldn't really give this fragrance too much higher of a rating in this category, but I do think that projection is average to below average. Next up we have Versatility, and I ended up giving this fragrance a 7 out of 10. I actually think that the versatility for this fragrance is really, really good. It's not a unisex fragrance, like I said, because of that ebony wood or black wood note. I think that that's what allows this fragrance to spill over into the masculine category a little bit. So it's not unisex, but of course, if you want to wear it, definitely wear it. Nobody's stopping you. In terms of social scenarios, that's really where this fragrance is like a Swiss Army knife. You can wear this casually, you can wear this semi-formally, formally. I do think that that ebony wood note does add that touch of sophistication in this fragrance, and you can definitely wear it on a night out because it does have that subtle sweetness in the background due to the vanilla and that more prominent sweetness due to the tonka bean. So I do think that it definitely comes across as being playful. So in terms of social scenarios, you can really wear it anywhere. I think it suits the nighttime use a little bit better, but you can wear it in the day as well. And in terms of seasons, I see this one being worn more in the fall and winter. I would personally wear it more in the fall and winter. Spring and summer, you can kind of get away with it on a cooler day, but I just probably wouldn't wear it in the dead of summer when it's really, really hot outside. So versatility on this fragrance is actually very good. And last up we have presentation. I already told you guys what I think about that. I know this fragrance's bottle has already been perceived as being tacky by a lot of people. I've seen tackier bottles out there. I think this one is actually kind of cool, and I like what they did between the 40 milliliter bottle, the 60 milliliter bottle, and the 100 milliliter bottle, where they just removed the amount of poker chips. So I think that that was kind of cool, and I ended up giving this fragrance an 8 out of 10 for presentation, which brings this fragrance to an average rating or an overall mark of 6.6 out of 10. So there you have it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. That was my review of The Game by Davidoff. Please don't forget to subscribe for future videos and frequent giveaways. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to shoot me a message. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Also, if you would like to see the criteria that I use for grading, I've left a link for that in the description section below. If you would like to join my Facebook group, please feel free to do so. We would love to have you as part of the family. I've left a link for that in the description section below as well. So again, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been Steven with another review from Adolescence. Thanks again.